I never imagined that my life, my marriage, and everything I thought I knew could unravel so catastrophically over one innocent-looking DNA test. That night, as I clutched the DNA report in my hand, the world around me seemed to slow down, my heartbeat pounding louder than ever. For nearly a decade, I had been raising a child I thought was mine, loving my wife like she was the only woman in the world, completely unaware of the betrayal woven into our wedding day itself. Now, it was my turn to take control. I had to get answers, not just for me, but for the family I thought was mine. And what I discovered led to a revenge so profound, so intense, that it left our lives in shambles, and I was just getting started. I remember the exact moment my life split into before and after. It was a Tuesday evening, one of those quiet, predictable nights that, in hindsight, almost seems ironic given the storm that was about to crash into my life. Sarah and I had been married for nearly 10 years, and our son, Jack, was 9, smart, energetic, and the light of my life. We were a typical suburban family, complete with Sarah's PTA meetings, Jack's weekend soccer games, and my predictable job at the local law firm. Life was as good as it could get, until that night. Sarah and I had decided a few weeks ago to try out one of those ancestry DNA tests. It was supposed to be a fun thing, a family project to dig into our roots. When the results arrived, I eagerly opened the email, expecting to see some unique heritage markers or interesting details about our distant ancestors. Instead, I was met with a cold and clinical phrase that I'd seen 100 times in TV shows, but never thought I'd read about myself: paternity does not match. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. I reread the report, my mind refusing to accept the words glaring back at me. But there it was, spelled out in clinical language that left no room for misunderstanding. Jack was not biologically my son. The air felt thick, suffocating, as I sat there, staring at the screen. My hands trembled, heart racing, and for a while, I just sat in silence, as if the world outside had frozen. Memories of Jack's first steps, his first words, our late-night story sessions, they all replayed in my mind like scenes from a movie. I didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but the evidence was right there. I heard Sarah humming from the kitchen. She was putting away the dinner dishes, oblivious to the bombshell that had just detonated in our marriage. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I needed answers, but I also knew I had to approach this carefully. Sarah was not someone who wore her heart on her sleeve, and any hint of accusation would likely shut her down completely. I needed to play this right. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I found myself staring at her, watching her every move. For the first time, I was seeing her differently, as if she were a stranger lying next to me. My mind raced with questions, none of which I dared to ask aloud. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready for what she might say. The next day at work was a blur. Files and paperwork piled up on my desk, and I went through the motions, pretending to work while my mind stayed locked on that DNA report. When I finally got home, I resolved to find the truth, no matter how ugly. I waited until after dinner, until Jack was in bed, and then I casually suggested we should sit down together. "Sarah," I began, carefully choosing my words, "you remember the DNA test we did?" She nodded, reaching for her glass of wine with a faint smile. "Yeah, what about it? Did you look at the results?" "No, I didn't," she said, laughing a little. "I thought it would be fun for you to tell me what they say. You know, keep it a surprise." I swallowed, struggling to keep my composure. There was something unexpected. Her face changed instantly, the smile fading, replaced by a slight tension around her eyes. "What do you mean?" I held her gaze, feeling my pulse pound in my throat. "It said Jack isn't biologically mine." For a second, I thought she might laugh it off, say it was a glitch, that it couldn't be possible. But she didn't. Her face paled, her hands dropping to her lap. I watched as the truth surfaced in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, before she composed herself, putting on the mask of calm I had seen her use so many times before. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling. I can explain." "Then explain," I said, my voice low, almost a whisper, as if saying it any louder would make it hurt more. There was a long silence, filled with a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "It happened a long time ago. It was right before we got married." I felt my stomach twist as she spoke, her words slicing through the fabric of our life together, ripping it apart, thread by painful thread. "It was one night, a mistake," she continued, her voice hollow. "It didn't mean anything, but then I found out I was pregnant, and I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, Mark. I thought if I told you, you'd leave me, and you were so happy when I told you we were having a baby." A cold rage simmered beneath my skin. "So you lied to me," I said, my voice barely audible. "You let me believe Jack was mine, all these years. Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded, her face crumbling. I was afraid. I was young, and I didn't know what else to do. And then, we were happy, Mark. We were so happy, and I convinced myself it didn't matter. Jack sees you as his father. You're the only dad he's ever known. For a moment, I thought I might actually lose control, that I might shout or throw something, or worse. But the anger inside me was ice cold, controlled, seething just below the surface. I stood up, turning my back to her. I couldn't look at her. Not now. I left the room and closed myself in my office, where I spent the rest of the night pacing, my mind in turmoil. I replayed our entire relationship, every moment we had shared, wondering how much of it had been a lie. By dawn, I had made my decision. This wasn't going to end with a quiet divorce, a hushed separation where we would simply split and pretend to be civil for Jack's sake. No. This betrayal cut too deep, too raw. I couldn't let it go. Couldn't pretend that it didn't matter. I spent the next few days carefully gathering evidence. I combed through old emails, messages, even receipts, looking for any clue that might tell me who this other man was, the one who had fathered my son. Finally, after days of searching, I found what I was looking for, an old email, buried in the depths of Sarah's archived messages. The name stared back at me like a ghost from the past. David. David had been my best friend, my best man at our wedding, the one who had toasted to our endless happiness that night. My hands shook as I read the email, piecing together their conversations, realizing that their relationship had gone much deeper than a one-night stand. They had stayed in touch, secret messages exchanged under my nose, right up until a few years ago. The betrayal felt deeper, more treacherous than I could have ever imagined. By the end of the week, I had a plan. It was a plan that would turn our lives upside down, that would leave no stone unturned, and no soul unscarred. If Sarah thought she could just live her life as though nothing had happened, if she thought I would go quietly, she was in for a rude awakening. The day after I confirmed everything, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. It was as if someone had pressed a switch in my mind. The raw anger, the desperation, and the betrayal had settled into something far colder and more precise. I didn't just want Sarah to feel guilty. I wanted her to experience a fraction of the betrayal she'd forced on me. And David, my best friend, the man who stood beside me on my wedding day, who'd celebrated our happy union as he shared drinks with our families and friends? He wasn't going to walk away unscathed either. My first move was to meet David in person. I needed to see him face to face, to watch the expression on his face when I confronted him with the truth. The man had built a successful career as a financial planner, known for his charm and seemingly perfect family. He'd built a life that, from the outside, looked as ideal as mine once had. But everything he stood for was about to crumble, and I was going to make sure of it. I called him on a Tuesday, under the guise of wanting to meet up for a drink, like old times. The ease with which he agreed almost made me sick, but I kept my voice light, hiding any hint of the storm brewing inside me. We met at a bar downtown, a quiet place we used to visit back in our college days. The nostalgia seemed to make him relax, settling him into a false sense of camaraderie. "So, what's new?" he asked, smiling easily as he clinked his beer bottle against mine. I could feel my pulse hammering, my anger flaring beneath my skin. I took a sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you, David," I said, meeting his eyes. "Something I recently discovered." He raised an eyebrow, giving a little chuckle. "All right, man, what's got you so serious?" I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough. "I did one of those DNA tests with Jack. Turns out, he's not my son." I paused, watching his face, waiting for the truth to register. The color drained from his face in an instant. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, then stopped, his eyes wide with shock. I could see his mind racing, trying to grasp at an excuse, a way out. "Mark, I don't know what you mean." "Save it," I cut him off, feeling the cold fury seep into my voice. "I went through Sarah's emails, David. I know. And I'm not here for explanations. I'm here to tell you that I'm going to ruin you." His eyes narrowed, but I could see the fear in them, the desperation. "You don't understand. It was one time. I never meant to." "One time?" I nearly laughed at the pathetic excuse. "I saw the messages, David. You've been in contact with her for years. You had no problem letting me raise your son while you paraded around as if you were my friend. So, no, I'm not here to hear your version. I'm here to tell you how this ends." His face paled, and he swallowed, his confidence fading with every word. "Mark, think of Jack. This would devastate him. You wouldn't want to hurt him. Don't you dare try to tell me what's best for my son." The words came out in a hiss, barely containing the rage bubbling up within me. "You're going to tell your wife everything, David, tonight, and you're going to cut off all contact with Sarah and Jack." From this point forward, you're out of our lives, completely. David stared at me, his expression twisted with anger and panic. You're making a mistake. I'm his father, and… You were never his father, I said coldly. You're nothing but a stain on my life, and I'll make sure you're erased from his. If you don't, I will expose you to everyone. Your wife, your kids, your colleagues, everyone. So, go home, David. Tell the truth, or I'll do it for you. With that, I turned and left him sitting there, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing as he fumbled for words that wouldn't come. That night, I went home feeling the first sense of victory since the DNA results had turned my life upside down. Sarah was waiting for me in the kitchen, her face tight with worry. I could see the toll my silence was taking on her. She'd been on edge ever since I'd confronted her, watching me carefully, trying to read my every move. "Mark," she said, barely above a whisper. "What's going on? You haven't said a word to me in days." "Don't worry, Sarah," I replied, letting my voice drip with sarcasm. "I was just catching up with an old friend. You remember David, don't you?" Her face froze, guilt flaring in her eyes. She knew I knew, and that was enough. "Mark, I'm so sorry. Please, let's talk about this. I know I made a mistake, but we can work through this. For Jack's sake, we can move past it." "Move past it?" I repeated, unable to contain the incredulous laughter that escaped me. "Sarah, you lied to me for nearly a decade. You let me raise another man's son without a single word of honesty. And now you want to move past it as if it's a bump in the road?" She lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I'd lose everything. I shook my head, disgusted by her excuses. "You already have." She looked up, startled, her tears drying as fear replaced them. I wasn't here to beg or plead. I was here to finish what she had started. I spent the next few days meeting with a lawyer, quietly preparing for the fallout. I'd done my research, ensuring that my case was ironclad. I knew that the courts wouldn't strip Sarah of parental rights, but I also knew I could secure a custody arrangement that would limit her influence in Jack's life. I wanted him to be with me, under my roof, shielded from the lies she'd built around him. And so, I set the plan in motion, step by step. The first part involved securing Jack's custody, a process that took weeks, during which Sarah tried desperately to win me back, alternating between remorse and anger. She accused me of being cruel, of punishing her over a mistake made in the past, but her arguments fell on deaf ears. Every time she brought it up, I reminded her of the years she'd chosen to lie, to betray me and Jack. And as much as her words stung, I stayed focused. My resolve had become unbreakable. As the custody case unfolded, I also took steps to ensure David wouldn't come near my family again. True to his word, he confessed to his wife, and the fallout was immediate. His marriage crumbled within days, and he moved out, spiraling into damage control mode. It was poetic justice, watching his perfect little life come apart, his facade exposed for everyone to see. By the end of it, he was a shell of the man he'd once been. But I wasn't done. I knew that Sarah still had hope that I might forgive her, that we could somehow salvage our marriage. She clung to that belief, telling herself that time would heal this wound. But I was going to ensure that no amount of time would erase what she had done. It was time for the final step. One evening, as Sarah sat in the living room, I brought out a set of envelopes. She looked up, puzzled, as I handed one to her. "What is this?" she asked, her fingers trembling as she opened it. "It's an invitation," I said, my voice steady and cold. "An invitation to the truth." Inside was a letter, detailing everything. Her affair with David, the paternity test, the custody proceedings. But this wasn't just a letter for her. The other envelopes contained identical letters addressed to her family, our closest friends, even her colleagues. I had copied every piece of evidence, every shred of betrayal, and I was prepared to mail them to every person who mattered in her life. Sarah's face turned white as she read, her hands shaking. "Mark, please, please, don't do this." "It's done, Sarah," I replied, my voice emotionless. "You wanted to keep your secret. You wanted to keep living your lie. But I won't let you. From now on, everyone will know exactly who you are and what you've done." She fell to her knees, sobbing, pleading with me to stop, to reconsider. But there was no stopping now. The die had been cast, and there was no turning back. When Sarah realized there was nothing left she could say to stop me, her pleading turned to anger. She rose slowly, her eyes hardening as she stared at me, a mixture of rage and desperation in her gaze. "You're a monster, Mark," she spat, her voice trembling. "You'd destroy our lives, Jack's life, just to satisfy your twisted sense of revenge." I met her gaze, unmoved. "I'm not the one who destroyed our family, Sarah. You did that the day you lied to me at the altar and for every day since. I'm just ensuring everyone knows the truth you kept hidden." For a moment, We stood in silence, the air thick with all the words left unsaid over the years. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I knew this was only the beginning. My decision to expose her wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the life she had taken from me, the truth she had buried for so long. But I also knew that revenge, once set in motion, takes on a life of its own, and I was prepared to face every consequence. The fallout was swift and brutal. True to my word, I sent out every letter, each carefully detailed confession reaching those who had stood by us through our marriage, her parents, her sister, our closest friends, and even our pastor. The phone calls started within hours. My phone buzzed nonstop as friends and family scrambled to process what they were reading, disbelief and shock filling their voices. Some of our friends reached out to support me, expressing their horror at Sarah's betrayal. Others tried to stay neutral, urging me to reconsider the public nature of my actions. Sarah's parents were furious with me, calling my actions vindictive and cruel. Her mother sobbed over the phone, begging me to think of Jack, of how this would impact him. But I remained steadfast. To me, there was no going back. Sarah's life quickly began to unravel. She had to take a leave from work, the shame and whispers following her everywhere she went. Our friends, divided by the situation, drifted away from her, unwilling to involve themselves in the spectacle our marriage had become. Her family, once a source of unshakable support, became distant, their disappointment palpable. The life Sarah had known was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But the hardest part came with Jack. Though I'd kept much of the turmoil from him, he was perceptive, sensing the tension between us. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me, his small face filled with confusion. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "why is Mom so sad?" My heart clenched at his question. I had prepared for many things, but explaining this nightmare to my son was not one of them. "Your mom and we're having some problems, buddy," I said softly, trying to choose my words carefully. Sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes that hurt people, even if they didn't mean to. But no matter what, you are loved, by both of us. He nodded, seeming to accept my answer, though the sadness in his eyes lingered. I felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me, the cost of revenge settling like a stone in my chest. I wanted justice, but I was beginning to see that vengeance came with a price, one that extended beyond Sarah and me, into the life of the child we both loved. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, court dates, and custody negotiations. I had already filed for divorce, and the proceedings were as brutal as I'd expected. Sarah fought hard, her legal team pushing to preserve her parental rights, but my lawyer and I presented a solid case, arguing for primary custody on the grounds of emotional stability and continuity for Jack. The court battles drained me, yet I pressed forward, determined to secure the best future for my son. Finally, after months of back and forth, the court ruled in my favor, granting me primary custody. Sarah would have visitation rights, but Jack's home would be with me. The relief I felt was tempered by the hollow ache of everything I had lost in the process. Our family, fractured beyond repair, was now bound by legal orders and visitation schedules. My pursuit of revenge had exacted a high toll, but I had achieved what I'd set out to do. The day the divorce was finalized, I found myself alone in the house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. The silence was deafening, each room haunted by memories of a life I would never have again. I had won, if you could call it that. The truth was out, Sarah was gone, and Jack was safe under my roof. Yet there was no satisfaction, no sense of triumph, only a deep, aching emptiness. Months passed, and life settled into a new, quieter rhythm. Jack and I adjusted to our routines, though I could see the impact the separation had on him. He became quieter, his once boundless energy replaced by a subtle sadness I couldn't erase. I tried to fill the void with activities, trips to the zoo, movie nights, and endless games of catch in the backyard, but nothing could fully heal the wound our broken family had left in him. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jack turned to me, his eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "Dad, do you think Mom will ever come back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked away, struggling to find an answer that would both reassure him and stay true to the reality we were facing. "She'll always be part of your life, Jack. She loves you very much. And even though we're not together, you'll always have both of us, just in different ways." He nodded, seeming to accept my answer, though I could tell he was still grappling with the complexities of our new family dynamic. In that moment, I felt the weight of everything I had done, every choice I had made, pressed down on me like a heavy burden. I had sought revenge, and I had achieved it, but in the process, I had fractured my son's world. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find solace in therapy, something I'd avoided initially. I sat down with a counselor, someone who helped me unpack the layers of betrayal, anger, and heartbreak I had experienced. Through those sessions, I began to understand the true impact of my actions, the way my desire for revenge had clouded my judgment, turning my life into a battleground of pain and regret. One night, while putting Jack to bed, he asked a question that pierced through the layers of bitterness I had carried for so long. "Dad, do you still love Mom?" The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to find an answer. In the end, I realized the truth was far more complicated than a simple yes or no. "I don't know, buddy," I replied, my voice soft. "Sometimes, when people hurt us, it makes it hard to love them the way we used to. But that doesn't mean the love wasn't real." He nodded thoughtfully, as if trying to understand the complexities of love and forgiveness, concepts far beyond his years. But in that moment, I felt something shift within me, a loosening of the resentment that had gripped my heart for so long. The next day, I picked up the phone and called Sarah. It wasn't a call to rekindle anything or to rehash the past. It was a call to set things right, to find some semblance of peace for the sake of our son. We agreed to meet at a park, a neutral place where we could talk without the weight of our broken marriage looming over us. When we met, I saw the weariness in her face, the toll the past months had taken on her. She looked at me, and for the first time since everything had come to light, I saw genuine remorse in her eyes. "Mark," she began, her voice heavy with regret, "I know I can't undo what I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to be part of Jack's life, to make this as easy as possible for him. That's all I want now." I nodded, feeling the bitterness recede as I listened to her words. The anger that had once burned so brightly had finally dulled, leaving in its place a quiet acceptance. "We can do that," I said, my voice steady, "for Jack." Over the following months, Sarah and I worked to rebuild a sense of stability for Jack. We established a co-parenting arrangement, one that allowed him to feel the presence of both his parents in his life. Slowly, we found a way to coexist, to move past the pain and betrayal that had once defined our lives. And as time went on, I came to realize that forgiveness wasn't about absolving her actions or pretending the pain didn't matter. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment, letting go of the weight that had held me down for so long. In the end, I had my revenge, but I had also found something far more valuable, a sense of peace, a quiet release from the anger that had once consumed me. And as I watched Jack grow, his laughter filling the spaces of our once broken home, I knew that I had finally reclaimed the life I thought I'd lost.